Howdy y'all. Welcome back for another story time with a Grimm's fairy tale. I'll be sharing with you tonight the story of Snow White. It's going to be in two parts, so this will be part one of Snow White. Snow White was collected and presented by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and is read to you tonight by myself, Tennille Milam. So, part one of Snow White. This story is not intended for children. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, and a queen sat at her window working, and her embroidery frame was of ebony. And as she worked, gazing at times out the window at the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood upon the snow. And when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child that is white as snow, and red as blood, and black as the wood of the embroidery frame." Not very long after, she had a daughter with skin as white as snow, and lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was named Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. After a year had gone by, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but proud and overbearing, and she could not bear to be surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic looking glass, and she used to stand before it and look in it and say, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking glass would answer, "You are fairest of them all." And she was contented, for she knew that the looking glass always spoke the truth. Now Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day when the queen went to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" it answered, "Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White fairer is than you." This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy. And from that hour her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. And envy and pride like ill weeds grew in her heart higher every day, until she had no peace day or night. At last she sent for the huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the woods so that I may never set eyes on her again. You must put her to death and bring me her heart as a token." The huntsman consented, and he led her away. But when he drew his cutlass to pierce poor Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and to say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood, and I'll never come home again." And as she was so lovely and so sad, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Away with you then, poor child." For he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared to put her to death. Just at that moment, a young wild boar came running by, and so he caught it and killed it, and taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen for a token. And it was salted and cooked and the wicked woman ate it up, thinking that that was an end of Snow White. Now when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even at the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts ran after her, but they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a little house, and she went inside of it to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and as clean as possible. There stood the little table, ready laid, and covered with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, and 7 knives, and forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and very thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup only a drop of wine, so that as to not finish up any one portion alone. After that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, and another was too short. But at last the 7th was quite right, and so she lay down upon it, committed herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs, whose occupation was to dig underground among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in the little house, they saw that someone must have been in, as everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting in my little chair?" And the second said, "Well, who has been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who's been taking my little loaf?" And the fourth said, "Who's been tasting my porridge?" The fifth said, "Well, who's been using my little knife?" And the sixth said, "Who's been using my little fork?" And the 7th said, "Who's been drinking from my little cup?" And the first one, looking round, saw a hollow in his bed, and cried, "Why, someone's been lying on my bed." And the others came running and cried, "Well, someone has been on our beds too." But when the 7th one looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White lying fast asleep. And he told the others, who came running up and crying out in their astonishment, and holding up their 7 little candles to throw light upon the sleeping Snow White. "Oh goodness, oh gracious," they cried, "what beautiful child is this?" And they were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but they let her sleep on. And the 7th dwarf slept with his comrades, an hour at a time with each, until the night had passed. When it was morning, and Snow White awoke and saw the 7 dwarfs, she was very frightened. But they seemed quite friendly, and they asked her what her name was, and she told them. And then they asked her how she had come to be in their house. And she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long until at last she had found their little house. And then the dwarf said, "If you will keep our house for us, and cook and wash and make the beds and sew and knit, and keep everything tidy and clean as we wish, then you may stay with us, and you shall lack for nothing." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed, and she kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold, And in the evening they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know where you are, and she will come to look for you. Let no one in the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart as she supposed, felt quite sure that now she was the fairest and the first in the land when it came to beauty. So into her mirror she said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of them all?" And the looking glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." Then she was very angry, for the glass always spoke the truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought, and she thought, and she thought, how could she manage to make an end of her? For as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face, and she dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. And in this disguise she went across 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 little dwarfs. And she knocked upon the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell." Snow White peeped out of the window, and she cried, "Good day, woman, what have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," answered she. "Laces of all colors." She held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. "Oh, I need not be afraid of letting this good woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbarred the door, and she bought the pretty lace. That's the end of part 1. I hope you come back and join me for part 2 of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Thanks. Y'all be sweet.